Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank Roger for, I'm not quite sure why he does this, but he seems to think I should come back every year, sort of like a storm. So I'm very grateful because I love this conference. I think it's a remarkable and unusual and unique gathering of extraordinary people. And I'd like to dedicate this little talk to Jerome Cohn, who was a great Arendtian scholar and a lover of poetry, and a dear friend who died earlier this year. So, I was thinking of calling this talk, "Your Gym Teacher and Your English Teacher Are Getting Married," as I believe that single sentence brought to countless thousands unmitigated joy. I might then have gone on to think about the difference between the lyrics of Nina Simone, Bob Dylan, and Taylor Swift as examples of how words shift and change over time, and the elastic space between private and public utterance. I decided against this idea as too difficult. I was thinking of calling this talk, "The Idea of Democracy Presents Us with a Difficult Joy." I decided against this as being too facile. According to your programs, my talk is called "O Frabjous Day, Notes on Difficult Joy." But in fact, I wrote a talk called "O Frabjous Day on the Joys of Difficulty," because a good friend advised me against difficult joy. Either way, the result is a hexagon of disparate beginnings. So that was a prologue. Beginning number one, coming toward the finality of what has been an exhilarating conference, but writing before it begins, I'm thinking that joy wants to stay in the realm of pure experience, somewhere in the synapses between body, heart, and spirit. Despite the varied and splendid eloquences of this assembly, joy doesn't lend itself to language. Its three letters seem to insist on a sense of immediate delight, unanticipated and sudden. Averse to abstraction, joy doesn't know how to live in any other tense than the present. It is difficult to represent. Here, ineluctably, comes the other word of my title, difficulty, the joy of difficulty. I'm thinking now that such a premise is a bit tired, a bit tarnished. This little scrap of language, the joy of difficulty, turns its back, looking into the recent historical moment known as modernism. Modernism excelled at presenting difficulty as a value. Modernism, playground of the avant-garde, chapel of abstruse indirection and irony, secular abstraction, dissonant invention, luring into its precincts the beautiful hydra head of theory. And now we find ourselves in an antechamber, in the small literalism of a postscript, the postmodern. We are all wondering what's next. I exaggerate, of course, in order to make a point and to see if somehow I can climb out of my retro bed. My title does include a phrase, "O frabjous day," found in a poem from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, published in 1871, Victoria on the throne, Ulysses Grant in the White House. And difficulty might bring to mind W.B. Yeats' poem, The Fascination of What's Difficult, written in 1910, creeping toward modernism, but not yet in the thick of it. Either way, the poem is a cry against modernism's oncoming fascinating difficulties, which it says have turned the mythic winged horse Pegasus into a workhorse dragging metal through the streets. Indeed, the fascination of what's difficult has rent spontaneous joy and natural content from the poet's heart. Yeats was not a fan of modernism. And so I cast back to the great ghosts of the 19th century, to the leaping, concentrated syntax of Emily Dickinson, who knew more about the joys of difficulty than almost anyone. We introduce ourselves to planets and to flowers, she wrote, but with ourselves have etiquettes, embarrassments, and awes. Beginning number 2. In fact, when Roger first asked me to participate, I had an altogether different idea, which was something along the lines of the joyful confessions of a childless cat lady. I had wanted to examine J.D. Vance's association of children, and by extension their mothers, with property. Vance said that the problem with a nation run by childless cat ladies is that they have no direct stake in the country. So we conclude children, for Vance, are crucial extensions of one's property, akin to house and yard. One stakes one's claim. This view is, of course, repugnantly retrograde. We recall that Thomas Jefferson had altered John Locke's trio of natural rights, life, liberty, property, to 3 unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson's swerve from property to the pursuit of happiness tells us something about the 18th century slave master, father, and landowner, and something about the 21st century ex-writer, J.D. Vance. The purport of my talk would have had something to do with how a single solitude might lead to the realm of freely chosen attentions to the world, and how these might arouse curiosity, care, and imagination as direct stakes in the nation's well-being. One might more readily respond to and acknowledge others, to extend the domestic outward into the world of strangers. Beginning number 3. You're okay? Only 6. Okay. Everyone loves Alice in Wonderland. It's an enduring and endearing fable of innovation, cunning, wit, and resilience. Forgive me, my invoking Alice here takes an autobiographical turn to when I was about 4, living with my family on 18th Street in Manhattan. My father was a journalist, head of the Moscow Bureau of Time Life during the Second World War. One Christmas, he sent home a small black disc on which he had recorded a letter to us on one side, and on the other, the Jabberwocky, the poem Alice discovers as she travels through the looking glass. Hearing my father's voice emerge from the speaker on a large brown Victrola was a source of comfort and joy. And the poem in which the monster Jabberwock is slain sent shivers of glee into my young, worried soul. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. Oh, frabjous day, Callooh, Calais, he chortled in his joy. Jabberwocky was the first poem I memorized. It is called a nonsense poem, but that isn't really quite right, as both children and adults are able to understand it. Making sense, I have often thought, is overrated if sense is aligned to pure reason. There are many things that happen to us which do not make sense, but which we nevertheless comprehend. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. Okay, this is nonsense, but in our inner worlds we somehow find ways to imagine what is being evoked, some weather, some creatures moving. This imprecise, intuitive knowledge suggests an opening, a place for what you imagine and what I imagine, if not identical, near enough to give us a shared sense of intimacy or nearness, joy as a sort of scent. The language of the poem collapses distance, and we are fully aware of being present to it and to each other. It suggests we are entering the realm of trust. After my father died of polio, my mother would play records at night. One of these was of the folklorist countertenor John Jacob Niles singing, "I wonder as I wander out under the sky, how Jesus our Savior was brought forth to die, while poor lonely people like you and like I." These lines, as I recall and say aloud to you, I can hear sung in my inner ear. I remember becoming aware that the words wonder and wander were almost the same. The strange, high-pitched sound of the singer was otherworldly and increased my awareness of a hovering mystery. I pictured myself walking under the night sky, not laying anxiously awake in bed, listening for the city's sirens. The words were clear, but their meaning was not. Perhaps it was then that I began to realize that meaning is not a single, literal fact. It is formed from an ensemble of relations. This is what I think Hannah Arendt understood as the crucible of human thought. Beginning 4. The difficulty of these dark times asks us to pay attention, and in that attention to do our best not to reduce reality to rote literalisms and simple acronyms. If we define the world as a series of slogans, then we inevitably become carriers of mistruths and poor judgment. The late Robert Redford, interviewed by NPR's Terry Gross, told her, "I was not interested in the red, white, and blue part of America. I was interested in the gray part, where complexity lies." Complexity is a near cousin to difficulty. We tend to think of them as equivalent. I am known as a difficult poet. This was never my intention. One does not set out to be difficult. My intention is to make poems that gather words together into a present that a reader might fully encounter and attach to their own experience, I want to make the poem into a third term that links sensibilities, yours and mine, making a kind of tacit, mobile, connective pulse. And here I am suddenly reminded of an encounter I had some years ago with John Cage. He's made a second appearance today, wonderfully with Bill T. Jones. He had a silent laugh, his mouth wide open, which felt to me as if some force or source was emanating straight from another realm, a Vatic signal carried into the world on Cage's silent ecstasy. What enabled this transfer of pure, joyful energy? I suspect it was at least in part a result of his practice of reception, concentration, attention, and response. Beginning number 5. Excuse me. One of the compelling things for me about poetry, about all forms of art, is how information is dissolved or absorbed into forms which cannot be translated back into raw data. Art asks us to attend and to interpret, interpreting as a form of translation into the meaning of an experience. Judgment is something else. Art, I have argued, is what humans invented to ease the fear of strangers, the fear of otherness. If you stand in front of a painting, say Matisse's L'Atelier Rouge, you receive an astonishing array of visual elements that make up a habitat of potential meaning. And the person standing next to you in front of the same painting also receives this ensemble. The painting silently joins your two subjectivities, confirming your differences while easing your estrangement, its potential meanings animated by your presences. This tacit correspondence is a form of joy. Final beginning, number 6. It is a known paradox that tragic art that addresses tragedy, can transform the wretchedness of life's cruelties and sorrows into wonder and joy. This is the work of form. In our dark time, as we witness a reality of unspeakable destruction and deliberate cruelty, accompanied by the most dismal, reductive discourse, the notion that art might be wrested from it seems indeed difficult to imagine. Many would claim such an attempt is both irrelevant and self-indulgent. A conundrum. Do we pay attention to what is happening on the public political stage, affecting all of our lives? Or do we turn away and tend to our friends and family, our pets and gardens and daily tasks? Should we stay local in community and give ourselves respite from the relentless, insistent news? If we stay local, can we find our way into a public that is near and tangible, embodied, and often in need? My own answer to this is to refuse to choose, opting to nurture and protect the inner lives of persons I care about while attending to the public words and deeds of those I despise and those I admire. I am reminded once again of the end of Emerson's great essay, Experience. It is a passage that I don't entirely understand, but nevertheless return to. In the end, he uses the word genius, by which he means an intrinsic spirit or intelligence. We dress our garden, eat our dinners, discuss the household with our wives, and these things make no impression, or forgotten next week. But in the solitude to which every man is always returning, he has a sanity and revelations which in his passage into new worlds he will carry with him. Never mind the ridicule. Never mind the defeat. Up again, old heart, it seems to say. There is victory yet for all justice, and the true romance which the world exists to realize will be the transformation of genius into practical power. I like to believe that art making is how humans unite a disparate, difficult, complex world into forms of possibility. Possibility animates hope. Hope is the key to change and to the joyful practice of just power. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. My role, we have about 30 minutes, I was told by Roger as we came up, so we'll go a little bit over what was on the schedule. And my role is to be discussant, and I'm going to say this, I just heard this for the first time, so I'm in the same place you all are, and I'm going to rely on your help to make this conversation go. I'll ask maybe 3 questions, Ann, to get us started, but it was so enormously rich that I apologize in advance for the weakness of my questions. So the 3 I'll ask, one is about beginnings. The second is about being a difficult poet. And the third is about how joy comes to us or how we come to joy. So I'll start with the first, which is why 6 beginnings? I'll say a little bit more about this, but I'm wondering why 6 beginnings and several titles, which I had heard about as you were preparing it. And I have a couple of thoughts, but I would be interested to hear what you say. And one of this, as many of you I'm sure know, Ann Lauterbach is the author of many books of poetry, which I encourage everyone, I'm sure you're now eager to read. One of my favorites is called Or to Begin Again. Or to Begin Again. So perhaps if one has that in mind, it's not so much of a surprise. But I'm also thinking about whether there's something about the multiple beginnings that correlate with joy. And something about I know you began again many times also because of the difficulty of writing about this. And so I'm thinking about beginnings and joy and whether there's some correlation there. And I have in mind 2 things that came up in the conference. Roger on the first day said that joy, trying to distinguish joy from happiness, said that joy is not the prize, but the surge or the urge, I'm not sure which he said, the urge or the surge to begin again, to start again, Roger said. And another thing that is on my mind is something that Tony Kronman said yesterday about, again, trying to distinguish joy from happiness, which was that he talked about it in terms of temporality. And he said that happiness is kind of enduring, if achieved, is a kind of enduring state, or can be, it can come and go, but it has a temporal duration, whereas joy is the experience of what time, I think I'm quoting, what time cannot undo. The timeless, in some traditions, the eternal or the divine, that joy is an experience in time of what's out of time. So I'm wondering about, in general, Ann, about why, the first question is why 6 beginnings? And more particularly, is there something about beginning again and joy that correlates?
Fascinating, thank you. This isn't on, is it?
It is, hold it close to you.
Yeah, you can hear? Joy and beginnings. I think it's possible when you fall in love that's a beginning, and there's definitely joy at that moment. There are a lot of beginnings that seem potential. I think it's about potential, right, rather than necessarily joy. You get on a train, it's a beginning, not necessarily a joyous beginning. So I'm not sure I want to equate them. I think for me, I like the idea of not so much. I like the idea of writing, making a form that isn't a continuance, which has a beginning and a middle and an end. In fact, I was going to say, students do not do what I just did when you're asked to write about something. This is not a good example. But I like coming at something from a number of angles and not to make an argument, because I don't actually like making arguments. I like kind of throwing something there and then something else there and then something else there. And then the idea, I think it's true of my poetry too, that the audience gets to make links among those beginnings, however they might want to. Whereas I think when you're sort of saying, this is my argument, follow it, and do you agree or don't agree? So I'm not actually interested in causing agreements or disagreements, much more than like offering possibilities. And this thing about the temporal difference between happiness and joy, it came up several times, it seems to me, and contradictorily. So I think, as I implied in the beginning of my beginning, one of my beginnings was that I think for me, joy feels to me to be very immediate and outside of time in the sense of its immediacy, like without duration in the way that we think of it. Whereas happiness, I think, is a state, a much more continuous state. I mean, and I'm thinking when Jefferson comes up with this phrase, which I'm not a good enough historian to know if he got it from somebody else, but the pursuit of happiness has always struck me as the most wonderful notion of a reason for doing something. This notion of pursuing rather than ever having. I find that very compelling.
A couple of things to follow up on that. One, it came up yesterday as well that joy is not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. It's not the pursuit of joy. And there's a question, it's going a bit off of what you were saying, but there's a question about the relationship between joy and politics, and whether joy is a threat to politics. That hasn't come up as precisely as I would wish. Maybe that will come up in the final panel. But going back to what you were talking about, there is something about the form that is not the essay form and not the argument form that is surprising, as you said. And I think it was Charlie Baxter yesterday read or recited Wordsworth's poem, Surprised by Joy. So there is something about that we don't know where we're going in one of your essays. We didn't know where we were going here. And so there was a constant surprise and I think a pleasure in that. The second question, I'll ask a second question, then maybe I'll open it up, and if there's time, come back to my third. I can't resist asking you this because you opened the door to it, which is about being a difficult poet. And I wonder if you didn't abjure that ascription. You said you didn't set out to be one, but you also didn't say, I'm not a difficult poet. And I wonder if you can say something about what you perceive as the difficulty of your poetry, maybe in comparison to or if you think about poets that are not difficult, who you admire, why are you difficult?
This is unfair.
Yeah. It's unfair to be your discussant after that, so.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is that I'm excited by the possibility that I can make a poem that does not assume my knowledge of it, but is actually a kind of, my poems often begin with a kind of linguistic offering that comes into my head. And it has a kind of vibration. It's a phrase, and I think, oh, that's an interesting phrase. And it's not really related to anything. It often happens when I'm vacuuming, for example. So it's not about the dust, or in this recent case, the yellow jackets. No, it's just a little piece of language that floats into my head, and I kind of think, oh, do you have something else to say? And then, I mean, this is quite literally true. And then I sort of find myself, as soon as I can, at the computer or with a pencil, and I write it down to see if it has something else to say. And if I'm lucky, it does. It has some kind of energy. And so that's really thrilling. And then I follow the energy. And the energy seems to be about something, I mean, the way I've phrased this at other times is to find out what I know that I don't know. It's something about starting with what I know and moving toward what I don't know I know, or language knows. And so it's like this following. It's like a kind of following. So it seems to me that if you write like that, that's difficult for others because they also have to do this following. And the following, if the poem is successful, it actually lands up with something to say that might be interesting. But it doesn't start with something to say. So the subject matter is always the last thing to declare itself. And I think that has to do with beginnings also. You know, you start again, and you start again, you start again. And sooner or later, it's like making stew or something. You have that ingredient, and that ingredient, and that ingredient, and then you taste it, and you think, this tastes okay. But all the different ingredients have sort of dissolved into the stew. I'm not sure I want to think of my poems as stews, though.
Metaphor aside, terrifically enlightening, and thank you for taking up the unfair question. I could talk to you forever, and would happily, but there are a lot of people in the room, and I'd like to open it up. So we'll open it for questions. Are there microphones here? I see. I'll just point around. I'll start right here.
This is the prize girl. You got a prize, didn't you?
It's not on.
Okay, how about now? There we go. Thank you so much for the care in your words. It was beautiful. I am also a poet, so I could not help but think of imagination while I was listening to your words. I find a lot of joy in the process of imagination, but that's not something physical, not something tangible. So I'm wondering if you can speak on, can we find the same kind of joy in our imagination, or does it have to be in our lived experiences? Is that a different kind of joy? Is it just as important?
It's sort of the nature of imagination to be in our inner lives, right? That's sort of where it locates itself. But there's a sort of interesting quality to your question, which I think must mean about application, right? How does one apply imagination to the world, right? So that's a political question, actually, and it's a question that makes you, well, it goes back to my horror of the diminishment of language in our political sphere right now. One of the things I took out of my talk was that joy was the opposite of the two favorite words of Donald Trump, which are sad and war. And you'll remember from the first administration of Trump, he used the word sad constantly. And now he seems to have sort of shifted over to war. But it seems to me that for imagination to come back into our political lives, the language has to awaken and become more imaginative. And that's a dangerous thing to say, because one of the things that I think people loved about Obama, for example, was how eloquent he was. And there was something extremely reassuring among the liberal classes of having this person who made these beautiful sentences. So that's not enough. The beautiful sentence isn't enough. But the political imagination is, a number of people, I think, have been talking about this indirectly all through the conference, which is we really need to imagine things differently, right? To have another way of thinking about what political action even looks like. I was talking to somebody earlier today that it becomes clear that everybody in this room getting up and protesting seems not effective, right? To go together to a place. It's reassuring because you're together, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything. So then the question is, what can we imagine doing that will be effective? I think it's a very important thing to think about. And it's also very important, the question that you're asking is really important because it takes imagination out of the place of fantasy and fiction and puts it where it has some kind of traction in the ways in which people treat each other in the real world, right?
I'll take a question over there, but just want to add one point to that, Anne. It's also the question of the care for language is, of course, central to Arendt, and the concern with cliché and the political damage that cliched language has is central to her thinking. Okay, so there's someone back there yes, that hand with stripes.
But I think Alice in Wonderland is a deeply political book, just by the way.
Hi, yeah. Is this on? Yeah, okay. You mentioned in your talk on the Declaration of Independence and the shift from the word property to the pursuit of happiness. And you also noted that this phrase was written by a slave owner. And I was wondering if there might be an implication there in the change from property to the pursuit of happiness. I wonder if you think it's a circumnavigation or a way of evading the implication that all people have a right to material things and a right to property.
It's such a good question. It made me think that I don't know enough about the figure of. Well, I know somewhat something about Thomas Jefferson, and thinking of him as being this enormously privileged person, right, with many children, some of them by his slave, shifting from property to the pursuit of happiness felt to me like an act of imagination, actually, that he, I can imagine, this is what I don't know enough about, that he decided that property was not essential to the well-being of the country or the people in the country. I mean, it's such a, because I think he took the first two words directly from John Locke. So he had the third word sitting there, property, and he rejected it. So I don't know what to say. You could make a kind of argument saying that since he already had property, he didn't think it was important. But I don't actually believe that. That takes away a certain kind of imaginative wisdom that he was projecting. No.
We'll go, maybe we haven't done that quadrant yet, or this quadrant here, down in the center there. And we'll go back there next.
Oh, frabjous day, which is one of the most wonderful phrases because it's so silly. And I love your pushing back of the idea of this being a nonsense poem. And yet there's something that's really beautiful about the nonsense. What I took in your multiple beginnings was you playing a game, like tossing a ball to us, and we got a chance to toss it back. You kept multiple tries that we could come to joy from these different perspectives. And I'm curious to you, what place does, well, and I'm also hearing a lot of curiosity, right? Like, let's look at it this way. Let's look at it over here. Let's check this out, right? Which is the wonderment of play. So I'm just curious to you, does play have any essence in your work, in your poetry, and how you come to the idea of joy?
Very kind. I'm suddenly thinking about who's the author of the play, which is a different question. I think I think of the day as a play. I plan very badly. I have, I don't like even the phrase bad habits because I don't believe in that as an idea. But I have, I think I make as much room as possible, given my age and my life, for something unexpected to happen, which I think is really what you're asking. And that part of my joy in life is for those very unexpected things to happen. And often they're very tiny. I'm lucky I get to look out on the world quite a lot because I have big windows. And a lot of the play of the world I get to see. And among animals and birds and so on, which I find just completely compelling. And also oddly comforting. It's not a very good question. I don't like games. I'm terrified of them. I don't ever want to be in a game where you win or lose. It's just like, I can't do that. It's a phobia.
There's a question we haven't had that quadrant yet, way in the back standing. I'm doing geographical diversity, that's the plan.
Thank you very much for sharing. I'm deeply touched by your words. I'm wondering if music plays a role in your writing. If you either hear it when you're writing or, and also thinking back to this morning's topic, if you go back and read a poem later, if it changes for you based on life events.
My own poem or somebody else's poem?
Your own writing, please.
What was the first part of the question? Music.
Does music enter your imagination sphere?
I think always. I think it's just part of my world, music, one way or another. I don't. John Ashbery listened to music all the time when he wrote, and it had a direct impact on what he wrote. I don't think I'm that kind of a poet, but I think that ever since I was a little girl, I started as a violinist, as a kid, and then a painter, and then a writer, and so there's a kind of constant synesthesia in my thinking or my making that I don't want to be precious about. But I think that the combination of hearing and seeing are in a kind of constant dialectical relation to language. They're never steady. So that once you understand, thank you, modernism, that an image is never an image in writing, it is always just language, then you have to think about imagery as sound, because that's the only way you're going to get the green to be green, is if you hear rather than see, because the green on the page is not going to be green, right?
And the last question, this urgent, yes, that person with glasses and an orange, yes, 2 hands up. And alas, this will be the last question, so read lots of Ann's books and write to her.
There was a study recently that showed that when AIs interact with each other, one can train the other subliminally. So if you train one AI to have a preference for owls over other birds, you can then strip owls from its output, and if it trains another AI on a data set of just numbers, the second AI will have a preference for owls like the first one does. And when I read that, I was terrified, because I know who created these AIs and what they're doing. But reflecting on what you said in the third and fourth beginnings of your remarks, and reflecting on Teju's obliquity gestures and Bill's apples and the words of "Oh frabjous day," I'm wondering if the best way to communicate joy is subliminally, if it has to be the metadata or the packets around whatever the content of communication is, that joy can't be communicated in the legal, lawyerly, this happened and this was joyful, but rather in this sort of the indirect evanescence around communication, and whether maybe that's the artist's project, and maybe it's just we've been hearing from artists, but maybe that is the sort of best mechanism for the communication of joy.
I think you answered your own question. Liminal, yeah. I think this whole conference has been an argument for human experience, right? That's what people have constantly said. The human is capable of having an experience that a machine will never be able to have. The simple reason for that is that we have bodies, right? And that our bodies feel things. I mean, to be very, very basic. And machines can't feel things. So if you start there with the tactility of the hand and the fact that I can see you and I can imagine something about the color of your eyes, but I don't quite know, that's a relationship of experience. It's nothing, it's not even very grand, it's just, is what it is. And I might get curious enough to get up and come and say, what color are your eyes? So I just think, I think the great question here about AI, as far as I can make out, is that we really, really need not to be, once again, put under the spell of the technological angel. He's had control over us for a lot of years now, and it is absolutely essential that we don't imagine that that spell can't be broken.
Please join me in thanking the fabulous Ann Lauterbach.